Can you hear me? Yes, you obviously can. I can even hear myself. Good afternoon. Welcome to a meeting that perhaps is part of a process that was inspired by a fairly awkward discussion we had in Norway last year, where there was some proposals by the government to make some minor adjustments to the civil society budget. Minor in quotation marks. And when I took up my position as Director General of Norad, and when I met with some of the Norwegian civil society leaders, we talked about the discussion that we hadn't had last autumn, because it had been so focused on the acute budgetary issue, and that there are actually some very important key challenges facing global civil society in developing countries, and international NGOs, including Norwegian ones, that we didn't talk about that much last autumn. So, as a consequence of that, we decided to make 2016 the year of civil society in our work. So, this is the appetizer, Eva, our communication director, would say, and then we'll continue. We'll issue our annual result report on results in development produced by civil society, and we'll have a much bigger audience discussing some of similar issues at our annual conference in December. So this is not the meeting to conclude. This is, and we don't have the power to conclude either, and we shouldn't have the power to conclude. But it is an attempt to stimulate an important discussion. And why do we think it is important to stimulate that discussion? I think simply because we talk a lot about global changes, and they're happening, real time, real life. And some of those changes have got important implications for civil society in many ways, along many dimensions. And among them, clearly, sort of, one discourse is about the space for civil society. Is it becoming both stronger and more restricted at the same time? Another important issue is about funding of civil society, and both the north-south dimension of funding and the private-public dimension of funding. A subset of that question is, of course, about the use of aid. Before I came to Norad, I was with the OECD, and we were specialists in counting aid. And our count would tell that on average 12% of the ODA from DAC members went to and through civil society, and that's an important distinction in itself. The Norwegian figure is about twice that, so 23%. So we have an unusually large share of our ODA to and through, because that, in spite of that, that ODA financing figure is in practice dominated by three big actors: US, UK, EU. Together account for about more than $10 billion per year out of the slightly less than 13 billion that DAC donors altogether give to civil society. So those three public, two governments and one intergovernmental organization provide the lion's share of that. Again, to remain with the figures of that, 90% goes through northern NGOs, through international civil society. Only 1.6 billion went directly, according to the statistics again, to civil society in the south. So we've got a funding model where some major donors, Norway included, have a very strong financing role for civil society, and we have a dominating financing model for that, which is through international civil society. I'm not making any value judgment about that. These are the business of throwing figures at issues. And then there are important questions for reflection, I think, and one of them is about funding and funding on civil society. And we've seen in the government sphere, we've seen a process over the past couple of decades, and particularly the last decade, where the aid dependency of most governments have decreased substantively. So the relative importance of aid as financing mechanism has decreased. It's not obvious to me that we have the same situation for civil society in the South. So there is a question about the overall financing. Then financing pattern, and particularly how can one raise more resources in the South to fund Southern civil society. Then there is, for us as funders, there's the big question of, maybe we could call it delivery agents versus change agents. What is it that we like to fund? Is it delivery agents for whatever we would like to deliver, or is it change agents? And what mixture of the two, if in practice we would like to do to fund both functions? But those two functions, of course, are quite different and may require very different competence, very different profiles, maybe even very different organizations. I don't have the answer to that, but that's so that is a key question for us. There's also a bit linked to that, but not totally overlapping, the question of what's the consequence of the professionalization of management of aid? Because when I look back, when I came back to Norwegian aid administration now after a decade, I could see the important changes that have taken place in the way we actually manage funds, the increased demands that have come as a result of public scrutiny, public debate, Auditor General's reports, you name it. And clearly, when we finance civil society, we have only one way of solving those problems, and that's to throw them at the organizations that we are funding and ask them to deliver on them in terms of results matrices, good management practices, zero tolerance for corruption, and so on. What's the relationship between that process and the objectives that we are trying to reach in financing civil society, and perhaps particularly the change agent part of civil society work? What we're trying to stimulate here clearly is not a Norwegian debate only. It's a debate that is going on in the South. It's going on in civil society space, and it's going on in many governments in our part of the world too. One of the risks one faces in a discussion like this is, of course, to overlook that civil society, the concept, covers a broad range of actors with very different perspectives, very different structures, very different mandates, very different experiences. When moving into the discussion, we've tried to cover a bit of that diversity on the Norwegian and international side, just to give a teaser of that, so that we've got both both broader, bigger, some would say more professional NGOs, and smaller, more targeted single issue type of organizations, both of which plays important roles in the development process. To kick off our discussion, we've invited somebody with a name that is both familiar and very difficult to pronounce. So he is the leader of Civicus, an umbrella international civil society umbrella organization. Danny Srishkandaraja. I'll never do that again. To hopefully both stimulate and provoke us into a discussion. And when he has done that, Svein Bæra, who is still heading our civil society department for another few weeks, will take over and lead the debate.